what if grief is a tool for maintaining closeness, maintaining proximity, maintaining respect for something that was really, really hard and for someone that we really, really loved?
Welcome to Love Link, your guide to relationships in all forms. We're your hosts, Simone Humphrey and Sina Simon. Today we have Lydia Duquette, who just started with us at Modern Mind to talk to us about grief and loss. Welcome, Lydia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So to start us off, we're curious how you became interested in grief and loss as a specialty. And this is a specialty that you started with almost right off the bat as a therapist.
It is. There are two parts to my answer. So the first one is going a little bit further back in time. I had actually just graduated from college, and my family went through a pretty big transition in terms of there was, divorce, there was loss, there was separation, and the dynamics kind of imploded. And I was really on shaky ground. And I think the loss of those relational frameworks was really when I started to think about grief and loss. But I will say it wasn't in a very direct way. Now looking back, I see that for what it is, but in the moment, I don't know that I would have said I was grieving. I might have said that I was sad or that things were hard, but I wouldn't really let myself use that language. But in retrospect, I definitely see that time period of my life as the point when my wheels started turning and I started to feel connected to this particular experience. And then the second part of my answer is a bit more recent, but it was actually right before I started my graduate studies for clinical social work. It was actually I think the second week of my first class. And I experienced a very traumatic loss in the family. And I had a very direct exposure to the trauma. And I kind of just sank. I was really, really struggling. And because I had just started school, my grief took a very active form. And, now, of course, I'm like, whoa, should I have paused? Should I have slowed down? But I took what I was feeling and I applied it to my studies. So I was really digging deep into the research and what are the frameworks that exist around grief? How can I bring this to my clinical work? And, what are the ways in which I want to apply myself to this particular issue? I think the more succinct answer is that I became interested in grief because it was happening to me. And I really wanted to make sense of my world.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that's so true of so many therapists who enter the field and have gone through something deeply personal and work through it and then want to help others. So It makes so much sense. So can you tell us a little bit about what grief is, how you define grief?
Yeah, I feel very connected to the words deep sorrow when I think about grief. And that is a fairly typical definition of it. But, you can also attach other words like, longing, sadness, yearning, distress. But for some reason, deep sorrow is what I like to turn to. It feels good to me and to my body, but that's my own thing. And so in my therapy work, I actually really like to define grief as one of the first things that I would do with my patients because it is so personal and it doesn't look the same for anyone. So I love the idea of working with a patient to really find the language for what they're going through and then, use that moving forward in the sessions, consider how it evolves over time. And I have some more pointed questions that I might use to make people more comfortable defining their grief. I really like to encourage patients to define it for themselves. And then another piece of like how I think about and how I talk about grief is just considering how it impacts the body. Grief, is happening to our emotional landscape, but it's also happening to our physical body. So I think as we're defining and like trying to find understanding when it comes to our grief, it's important to consider how our body is feeling, like where that loss is most present in the body so that we can start to move through it in a more holistic way.
And what have you noticed about the difference between grief that occurs around a death and grief that occurs around loss? We can have many losses in our lives, relational loss, loss of a job, moving to a new place, going through a transition and having loss in that experience. So I'm curious what those differences are, if there are differences.
Yeah, I definitely think there are differences. And I think for me, the visual of grief as a volume dial has been really helpful. Like sometimes our grief is just a low murmur in the background. And then other times it's full blast and you can't hear or feel anything else. It's just completely overpowering. So I love this visual of like, kind of swinging it from one end to the other. And I think depending on the type of loss, you exist somewhere on that volume dial. And it changes too. Like you can be experiencing the most traumatic thing, and then over time it starts to, feel softer, and the edges start to curve, and you feel like you can, navigate the world with a bit less of that like overpowering feeling of grief. But to answer your question about the distinction about the two, I think this idea of being able to neatly categorize grief is maybe just not always productive when you're actually going through it. Again, I think it really depends on the situation, but I guess I really just don't want people to feel like they're comparing their grief experience to someone else, or like if you're experiencing grief from a loss that maybe is like not a death and it wasn't necessarily super traumatic, that you can't feel all of these things. But then that same argument also has like another side of it, where I do think it can be helpful to find community and solidarity within a specific type of loss. When I was in grad school, I was working very closely with a doula program, and we started to see that there were a lot of people who had experienced pregnancy loss or a termination or any kind of perinatal loss, and they really needed support. They needed grief counseling. They needed to find community in that particular type of loss. And so we ended up developing and co-facilitating a grief workshop for perinatal loss. And the feedback that we got was just like they felt so much more comfortable coming into the space, knowing that the other people in the room had that as an entry point as well. So I do think sometimes it is helpful to consider your grief or your loss alongside other people who have experienced similar, but I don't think it's helpful to compare in a sense of like, is this valid or not? Does that make sense?
I say that no two people have the same experience. Two people can actually experience the exact same loss, like the death of a family member or parents who experience the death of the child, and it's going to look so different between them. Yeah. And yet, I think there's something that's so lonely about grieving. Mm-hmm. And so to feel like, okay, I'm with other people, I've lost something or someone, and now I'm in connection with someone else is such a, like an antidote.
Yeah. Yeah, I think grief gets sticky. People feel like hesitant maybe to use that word or to let themselves like really explore it, because there's that peripheral of like, oh, but that person probably feels much worse than I do, or like their loss was so much more grandiose than mine. Like I don't want to take from them, but you can't really view it as in a comparative way. But I think that it definitely can be hard to like let yourself go there and let it be a deeply personal thing. I think we tend to kind of invalidate grief for some reason culturally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it really prevents, I think it's a good point that you can't compare your experience to other people, because you'll always find somebody who has a bigger loss. And also it really minimizes, like I'm thinking of a patient that I have worked with who experienced pretty traumatic birth. So her child is fine, but the birth experience was not what she had wanted it to be. And it was a major, major loss for her. Mm-hmm. And she didn't go to therapy for a long time because she felt like, well, like, this is an inappropriate kind of feeling that I'm having. Yeah. Some people have lost their babies.
Yeah.
Right. But then it really prevented her from moving through the feeling. So I think that piece around not comparing to other people's experience, right?
Yeah.
It's really important. Like also this idea, like compare and despair. Like if you compare, you'll just feel bad about yourself. Like I'm not supposed to have these feelings, or this is inappropriate.
Yeah, exactly. I think there is this really harmful tendency to, I guess, kind of like move away from what you're experiencing because you don't think it should take up real space in your life. I think people really don't want to do anything that's quote unquote wrong. And sometimes we feel like our grief is wrong or like it's not valid enough. And so we just quiet it or we suppress it. And that is where, all of these other darker emotions start to surface because it's like being channeled into something else. Like maybe that's anger or resentment or, difficulty in your relationships.
So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed this, I think it's 5-stage model of grief and how people go through these different stages and then finally get to this endpoint. And I think it's been kind of upturned in that there's a consecutive order. But I'm wondering in your work, do you think about these stages? Do you use them? Are they helpful for you? Or are they something that, I don't know, is kind of archaic now?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat been broken down. Like you said, I think people don't turn to this in a very direct way anymore when we're talking about grief work. But I don't know. I think it can be helpful as a sort of like reference point. But my issue is just that, grief isn't like a ladder that you climb. And as you're working your way through these stages, you get to the top and it's like, woof, we did it. Like that's not how it's worked for me. And it's not how I've heard it be explored with patients. So yeah, I think the nonlinear understanding of grief is far more accepted and kind of the norm these days. And I definitely embrace that because, the danger is like, okay, if acceptance is the final stage and one day you feel really good, like you're feeling like so much better than you did day one. And you're like, I did it. I conquered it. I reached acceptance. And then the next day you feel like total anger, total denial, just like, why did this happen? Are you going to feel like you're grieving quote unquote wrong or that you've like gone backwards or that you're going to have to move through all the other phases in between in order to get back to acceptance? I just think it creates all of this room for self-critique. And that to me does not serve grieving in a positive way. So I definitely kind of resist bringing it into my work, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. I think like, especially in the academic space, like these things are helpful. They've been developed for a reason and they're being considered for a reason. But yeah, I've just found that it's not been super helpful in like a practical sense.
Yeah, it sounds like it's better to conceptualize it as there's all these different experiences that one can go through: denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, acceptance, and that they're all normal, but there's not really any particular order. And actually, if the hope is to get to acceptance, you may get there and then also experience these other different feelings afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Going back to that volume dial, like you might feel like, okay, like it's there, but it's low and it it's feeling like I can kind of step away from it for a moment. But then again, the next day you might feel something totally different. And if you're resistant to that idea of letting it be nonlinear and letting your body and your emotional landscape move from one thing to the other, you're going to feel bad. Like that's going to make you feel like you've done something wrong. So yeah, I just don't want people to feel that way about themselves when they're grieving.
So how do you work with grief with your clients? What have you found useful? And I'm also curious, since you brought up your own personal experience, what you yourself found helpful, if you'd be willing to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my work and then also for myself, I definitely aim to work with grief as opposed to through grief. I've really embraced this idea that grief lives with us. It's happening inside the body, and I don't think it just goes away with time. I think it will soften with time, but my aim is to form a more positive relationship to the grief. Like, how can it be a source of connection? What does it tell me about the love that I feel towards the person or the thing that I don't have anymore? I think grief is like an entry point for considering like the full range of the human experience. We experience joy because we also experience sadness. We experience loss because we have the capacity to love very deeply. And I think those dualities I really like to bring into work and bring into my work and let them be explored with intentionality. So yeah, I think like really letting grief have this kind of like longer, softer relationship with yourself is helpful to me and seems to be helpful with patients. And then, yeah, always just embracing grief as an embodied experience, as something that, you need to be in tune with and, make sure that you're functioning, that there's not, risk of harm or any kind of safety concern. Like there's definitely a scale where, it could go too far to one end and it's like, okay, we need active support. We need to make sure that we're, able to meet our body's needs and like function in the world. But yeah, I think like letting grief be something that we build a closeness to as opposed to feel like we're supposed to distance ourselves from is important in my work. And again, going back to those questions, like asking, what is grief like for you? Is it something you can see? Is it something you can feel? Is it something you can touch? What reminds you of your grief? When you think about your grief, what do your thoughts say? Just like always considering how it's showing up for you on any given day, just connecting to it and really gaining a full picture of how it's showing up in your world is important. And that's when I've seen, in myself and then also in patients, I've seen them move towards healing.
Something else that I've found to be really powerful in working with someone who's the death of a loved one, someone especially very close, is to help them continue that relationship, even though it's in a different form. Of course, I don't think this works for everyone, and I think some people it may not be so helpful. But I think for some, there's this real power in recognizing that even though a person is no longer in this world, that they can still be really alive within us, and that it's possible to have an active relationship, whether that's thinking about them or speaking to them or even writing a letter or imagining them, feeling their presence, feeling how they might feel if they were to see that person. And it's this really beautiful, a little woo-woo in some ways, to kind of imagine that there's still a kind of a spirit in whatever form there.
Yeah, I love all of those things. And I definitely bring that into the therapy space, but also into my own personal life. I think the sensory elements are very important to me when we're talking about grief and moving through grief. One of the ways that I like to do that is through music. I think it's a really beautiful tool for tapping into your deep emotions and then also kind of associating it with someone or something. So in the grief workshop that I did in grad school, in between week 1 and week 2, we actually asked participants to bring in a song that made them feel connected to the thing or the person that they had lost. And then they could either share out loud or share anonymously on a note, like why that song made them feel connected to that thing. And it was just such a beautiful exploration of nonverbal ways to connect to someone or something. And to build that kind of association, I think, is really impactful for the grieving person, because it's a thing that you can turn to in a moment of sadness. You know, if that volume dial is really high and you're like, I need something to ground me. I need something to make me like feel connected to that thing. I love that you can just hit play on your phone and be like, okay, I'm like feeling a lot right now, and I'm feeling like connected, and I'm feeling that love, and I'm feeling the loss. And, you know, for those 3 or 4 minutes, however long it is, you just like let yourself be in it. So that's a very like, you know, practical. I really love doing music for myself and for patients, but there are so many ways to do it. Like you said, I think letter writing is wonderful. You know, symbolism, a lot of people will assign meaning to certain objects in the world. Like, you know, canary bird means like they're thinking of me, or that they're, you know, supporting me in this moment. And for me, when I experienced the loss, wind became a thing that was like really important for me. Like just a cold gush of wind to the face was like, okay, I can feel you, and I'm in touch with you in this moment. And I still do it now. I mean, it's a breezy day, and on the way here, I was like feeling that wind, and I was like, wow, I love it. I think assigning meaning to, you know, you find what works for you. And I definitely encourage patients to do the same. This is a little bit like off of this topic, but the anniversary of the loss that I experienced was just a couple of weeks ago. And I had a lot of friends and family reaching out, you know, how are you doing? How are you feeling today? And just being very supportive and kind. And the thing I kept saying, and that kept like coming up for me, was just this word reverence. And that word just means deep respect for someone or something. And it felt and continues to feel like a word that can hold like the expansiveness of loss and death and grief. And I've just been really like thinking about that word a lot, and I just love it. And I think, similar to what I've been saying throughout our conversation, I love this idea of like really letting our grief be something that we engage with, and something that makes us feel connected to the thing or the person, as opposed to something that marks something bad or something that is going wrong for us. Like, what if grief is a tool for maintaining closeness, maintaining proximity, maintaining respect for something that was really, really hard, and for someone that we really, really loved? Like, what if grief is the tool for feeling connected to all of that? So I don't know, that word reverence is like, I feel like I want to read a book about just that word right now.
It's a beautiful word too.
It's so
just
beautiful.
To say, yeah.
Framing grief as reverence, which is really beautiful.
Yeah.
That actually it's a really important experience, because it allows us to continue to have reverence for things that are no longer there, and how powerful they are.
Yeah. And maybe it's not like tick, tick, tick. Okay, I made it. I did my grief, and like, here we go on to the next thing. What if it's like, it's here and it's going to live in me forever? And I want that to be important.
Hi, LoveLink listeners. Our group practice, Modern Mind, is located in New York City, with offices in Brooklyn and Manhattan, offering in-person and virtual psychotherapy. We provide individual, couples, and group therapy, as well as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in conjunction with a psychiatry prescriber. Therapy is a powerful experience that can transform your life and help you live it to its full potential. We're here to help take you where you want to go. To find out more about our practice, visit www.modernmind.co or email info@modernmind.co to be connected with one of our therapists.
I like the idea of reverence for grief, like, because it's so big, there's so much around it, right? There's a spiritual component, and it is something to be respected. And I was thinking about, sometimes I've had this experience. I know many patients who've had this, you two may have had this experience, where you have a big loss and a lot of complicated feelings come out about the person that you've lost, or about the thing that you've lost. Like, there's the feeling of loss, and then maybe also some relief that that aspects of the person are no longer there. There might be anger, or there's sadness. It's like a lot. It's like a soup of different feelings. And I was curious, we can have reverence for processing all of that, and all, like, how big that is too, and how important that is to move through. And I'm curious how you might think about working with patients where it is a more complicated picture.
Yeah. Well, I think the point you're making is excellent. And it's important to remember that grief is not just sadness or, like, these feelings of anguish. It can often have more quote unquote positive feelings too. And I think the best way to work with a patient who's experiencing those complexities is to really give them a forum to explore that complexity, because there's going to be shame if you're feeling those things. Whereas, like, sadness is more normalized. Like, people expect you to be sad when you've lost someone. But if you're feeling relief, like, you might not feel like you can say that to that many people. So I think letting therapy be a concrete forum where you can explore those things and express those things, and it's the therapist's responsibility to allow you to do that. I think if you're able to do it in therapy, then you might feel more comfortable being more honest in your other relationships and other conversations that you have. So, yeah, I think letting people explore all of that, and maybe it's, soft questioning of, like, are you feeling anything else? Is there something adjacent to what you're feeling with your sadness? Like, is there more underneath? What are the layers that you're experiencing? And it kind of goes back to that idea of breaking down language and not just taking things at face value, but maybe, like, inquiring further, remaining curious, like letting it evolve over time too, because you might come in immediately after a loss and feel deeply, deeply sad. And then 6 months later, you're feeling something totally different. So I think in therapy, the therapist should be checking in and, like, always exploring how your grief experience is evolving over time to make sure that you have a forum for expressing those complexities.
And so critical, because we also know if some of those emotions don't get processed, it can lead to what the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, identifies as complicated grief, which is really a form of depression. And that grieving is such an important and healthy part of loss. But when we don't process it well, when we repress it, or when we don't work through it in a way that's helpful, it can lead to clinical depression. And that's a real problem.
Yeah. And guilt and shame are really powerful things in our lives. So if those start to take over because you're not allowing yourself to really feel what you're actually feeling, you're going to start to crumble, and your functioning in the world is going to be more and more arduous because you're not being authentic about what your experience actually is. And I think there can also be a tendency to maybe, like, perform grief. And we see that all the time in rituals and, the kind of societal norms that exist around it. But I think honesty in the therapy space, but then also in life outside of that, is critical, because you shouldn't have to perform grief in a way that you think will be tolerable to others. But it's hard because these ideas and frameworks are very long-standing and they're deeply rooted. So you have to kind of actively resist that comfort of, like, oh, I'll just show people what I think they want to see from me right now. I'll just perform sadness because I think that's what people expect of me. So yeah, I think really breaking down those tendencies is important.
I wish there was more education around grief, you know, in school, like the kids learn more about grief. As adults, there was more of a conversation around grief because, you know, when you talk to people, everybody experiences loss. And when you talk to old people, like they've lost everybody sometimes. Mm-hmm. And especially in the West, like we don't have a lot of good rituals around it. I mean, maybe, you know, people who are more religious, actually, I don't know if they do better, but it seems like, you know, there's more community, there's maybe more of a conversation. But if you're not religious, and it's harder, I think. Yeah. It is more isolating, and people don't know what to do with it. And they also don't know how to relate to each other around it. Mm-hmm. So this is a really important conversation.
Absolutely. I will say that I found it interesting during COVID that the idea of loss and grief came up a lot in a way that wasn't about the deceased. And I think that was really new. And because everyone had this shared sense of loss, it was being articulated in this new way. That's the first time I've ever really heard grief and loss not only talked about so openly, but really as this, like, what could have been. And I did think that was really important. And then, you know, COVID passed and we are all back to our normal lives and we no longer talk about it.
We have amnesia for all this, like, this big experience we had. Yeah.
Completely. Yeah. COVID, I think, flipped a lot of these ideas on their heads a little bit. Like people really were talking about it a lot, but it was still very confusing and still very much like this is on a scale that it feels like we're not quite ready to, or like equipped to handle. Cause I mean, how could we have been? But yeah, I think it's definitely marked a shift in terms of how we think about grief and how we talk about it. And I actually wrote my thesis on how grief and physical space interact and the importance of physical space. And that was, you know, in the throes of COVID. And the reason I was thinking about it so much is like people experienced loss often in their homes. So, you know, the person that they loved may have died in a hospital and they didn't have access to them. And so therefore, like the goodbye was remote and it also was happening in the space that they occupied. So how does that affect our ability to continue occupying that space? Is, you know, can space be a source of healing? Can it be harmful if it kind of, you know, re-traumatizes us, or if it like starts to signify something very difficult in our lives? So yeah, I think it's important to not just explore what we're feeling inside, but also how everything that's happening around us is impacting that experience too.
So we've been doing some analytics on our social media, like just, you know, like what's getting the most hits, I guess, on our Instagram page. And one of the things people seem to be most interested in is like how to cope with heartbreak, you know, how to move through a breakup. And I'm curious, what comes up for you around that, around the end of romantic relationships and helping people in that grieving process?
Yeah, I wish I had a one-size-fits-all response here, but I really don't. I think it's just so personal and it depends on, you know, not just the type of heartbreak or breakup, but the people that are involved. I will say, I think time really does soften the edges of heartbreak. And I know that maybe is annoying to hear because it's such a cliche, like time heals everything, but it really does. I think it's important when it comes to grief and loss and heartbreak and divorce, whatever it may be. But I think what I try to focus on when someone in my life or a patient is experiencing heartbreak or going through a breakup is that your pain right now is happening. Like it is painful. This thing is hard, but there is more ahead and there is good ahead, and your pain can evolve, you know, like feel it right now. let it be what it is, but let there also be hope for how it's going to move in you over time. And I think really turning towards the pain is when it can shift into something different, into something better. And when I say, turning towards the pain, I don't mean like call your ex. That's not what I'm saying. But I mean, sit with your pain, like sit with your longing, sit with your discomfort, and just be honest with yourself that this is really hard. And life is rich because we experience pain. We experience love, and we experience love that goes away. We experience love that changes. We feel all of those things. And I think breakup and heartbreak is especially difficult because we're feeling all of that at once. Like, it's pain. I still maybe love you. But I don't think I should be with you anymore. Like, it's like so many things are happening at the same time. And that is why the time passing, I think, helps like those things start to simplify and start to kind of like reformat in our brains and in our emotions so that we can be more open to something else or to someone else, or even just more open to ourselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also there's something about organizing all those feelings because, like you said, it's not so simple. Sometimes it's not even just about the person that you've had this breakup with, which of course there's a lot of pain around that, but also it's about feelings of rejection and abandonment that might not just be about that person, but previous experiences of rejection and abandonment. It might also be loss of the future that you had planned for yourself and a sense of control. I mean, there's just so much wrapped in it. And to be able to understand, okay, what is this bringing up in you about this particular loss, but maybe other kinds of losses from your past. So we can really help you kind of work on healing some of those older feelings too, and taking care of the younger parts that might be activated. And I also love what you say around holding the hope, because I do think when you're in a breakup, it's so hard to see the future. And so you can really wallow in this hopelessness around, like, I'll never find anyone again, or no one will ever love me, or I'm broken forever. And on the one hand, it's like I have so much empathy and understanding. I've been there. And also, like, we have to hold the space that says, and that's not true. You're not broken. You won't be alone forever. Like, we know people move through this and can move through it, but they might not see it.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard. You can definitely be blinded by pain, blinded by rejection. There are so many emotions that can make us feel like we can't feel anything else. Like, that's the dominant thing at any given time. And therefore, like, how could I possibly be happy in a couple of months? Like, you just can't see it. So yeah, I think you need support systems, and, maybe it's therapy. And I think you need someone to remind you of that, for sure.
Yeah, sometimes we have to hold the hope for our patients.
Yeah.
Or friends.
Yeah,
or whoever,
totally.
In our lives who are going through it. It's so hard.
Totally. Yeah, and I think breakup is a good example of an area where people don't necessarily want to use the language of grief and apply it to what they're feeling. I had a friend that is going through a breakup, and she said to me, like, it's almost like I'm grieving. And I just responded to her and said, you are grieving. And it like broke her down. Like, she was able to really validate herself in that way of like, whoa, this is a loss. This is hard. This is devastating. This is complicated. It's all of those things. But for some reason, I think we don't necessarily always think we can use that framework and apply it to a breakup or a loss that isn't death. So I think it's important to figure out how to become more comfortable talking about it and applying it to these different loss experiences.
Well, this has been such a great conversation. I've learned a lot just in talking to you about grief, and I think it's going to be so helpful to have more for our patients around grief in the practice.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been really fun to talk about. I mean, it's a heavy subject, but I think in talking about it, you can really feel the nuance and the complexities and the dynamics of grief are so much more than just like heaviness and sadness. Like there's a lot of good that can come from grief too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so important for us to remember that we all are all going to die, and it's a part of life, and it's an important part of life. And there's a kind of, like you said, a real reverence for that. And I think remembering that it's so important to how we think about ourselves and others.
Yeah, absolutely. We will all know loss, and it's important to really tune into that and to hopefully be able to navigate it with a bit more warmth and softness.
Thanks, Lydia.
Thank you.
Thank you.